We're excited to announce that Consul 1.16 Sameness Groups is now in public beta, and linking existing Consul clusters is now generally available. Sameness Groups enables developers to share service names between partitions, and now, with the ability to link existing Consul clusters, it doesn't matter where you've deployed Consul to. Your clusters will now show up in the HCP Consul management plane. I'm in the studio with Van, who works here at HashiCorp as a technical product marketing manager. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, Jordan. Thanks for having me. I'm definitely excited to talk about the features in Consul 1.16 and also the new features for the HashiCorp Cloud Platform.
But before we get into the new releases, you may be wondering, why are developers adopting Consul on platform teams? Well, lots of the feedback that we've gotten is that Consul simplifies how services can be discovered across different runtimes and cloud environments. We've heard from developers on how much Consul reduces the time they spend on securing and encrypting their application services. Platform operators are also able to save time since they no longer have to worry about allowing or denying service communication based on IP addresses. And lastly, many workflows are automated and can be offloaded to Consul and Terraform, which is a huge time savings for developers. The developers that we work with need the flexibility to integrate with all sorts of other cloud products like Datadog, New Relic, and so much more. That's why we focus on Consul supporting a rich and broad ecosystem of partner plugins supporting cloud, APM providers, and platforms such as databases and Kubernetes. Because of this widespread support of Consul adoption and integrations with these third-party services, we've seen some of the largest companies in the industry adopt Consul to improve speed, efficiency, and mitigate risk in their organizations. If you want to read more about how Pandora, Stripe, and Tide integrated Consul into their stack, you can read all about their customer stories on our website. Now that you have a brief overview of Consul, I want to hand it over to Van to talk about the new Sameness Groups feature in Consul and also chat about how you can link your existing clusters into HCP Consul for centralized management.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. So in Consul today, you can configure services to fail over between different Consul partitions and clusters. However, when doing it at scale, it does require a few extra steps, which is not ideal. And the reason for this is because admin partitions and cluster peering is predicated on the assumption that you have different teams managing and controlling different Consul partitions and different Consul clusters. And therefore, by design, we assume that services that have the same names are completely different services between partitions and clusters. However, the challenge with these assumptions is that not every partition or cluster is owned by different teams. For example, you can have a single team that owns multiple Consul clusters and partitions with service failover configured between them. And therefore, you'd want services with the same name between the partitions and peered clusters to be treated as indeed the same service. When they're not treated as the same service, it becomes a bit cumbersome because you need to list out exactly where you want the services to fail over to. So in 1.16, one of the features we've released is called Sameness Groups, which aims to simplify the failover configuration. Sameness Groups is a logical collection of partitions or cluster peers where services with the same names are treated as the same service. This really helps configure service failover with fewer steps. So now with Sameness Groups, as long as the clusters have been peered together and services have been exported, failover can occur automatically. For example, in the same Consul cluster, a service can be failed over to another partition if the service name is the same. And if that second service fails, it can automatically be failed over to another peer Consul cluster entirely. As long as the Sameness group exists for these services, we can fail them over in a more natural way with less configuration steps.
Well, it's exciting to see how Sameness Groups makes it easier for developers to set up high availability across different partitions and clusters. And in our last new releases webinar, we were actually in the studio together talking about the HCP Consul management plane, which we launched it last quarter. And it provided developers with global management of all of their Consul clusters, whether they were HashiCorp managed or self-managed. What's great about this feature is that it allows unified management from a single pane of glass.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So there is, however, one stipulation where previously In order for HCP to see and manage these console clusters, you would have needed to deploy them from HCP in the first place. So if you deploy Consul directly onto VMs, or if you deployed it onto, say, a Kubernetes cluster using like a Helm chart outside of HCP, they wouldn't show up in the HCP management plane at all because HCP is not aware of it. So in the latest HCP Consul release, we now have the ability to link and bring the existing Consul clusters into the HCP management fold. Now operators can have a truly global management and view across all clusters, regardless of how they were deployed in the first place or where they were deployed in the first place.
So I think this is a great opportunity now that we've kind of given an overview of these new releases for us to actually see a demo of it working in action. Would you be able to show us how it works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a demo here. What I'm going to show is the ability to link some external Consul clusters into HCP. And once I link them, I'll use cluster peering and then Sameness Groups to show some service failovers. Okay, so what we're looking at is my HCP management plane. I have two Consul clusters already in HCP, DC1 and DC2. All right, one's HashiCorp managed, one's self-managed. I also have two other Consul clusters, DC3 and DC4. They were deployed externally onto AKS, and we're going to bring them into HCP. And as you can see here, if I go to the UI for each cluster, it's pretty bare. There's not a whole lot going on inside of each of these clusters, but we'll add some services in a bit. Okay, so going back to my HCP management plane, I'm going to click on Deploy Consul, and then I'm going to select Self-Managed Consul, and I'm going to select the link an existing self-managed cluster. All right, so then we'll select Get Started. So this is how we initiate the linking process. I'm going to give it a name, so it's just going to match my Consul cluster name, DC3. I'm going to keep it as Kubernetes, since that's what it is. I'll say Continue. And then I'm given a few options to use Consul KCLI or Helm, and I'll select Helm because that's how I deployed in the first place. And then I'm given a few steps here. Basically, they just copy and paste commands that I will bring into my terminal. So I'll take the first one, I'll copy that. It's a set of Kubernetes kubectl commands, and I'm going to paste it into my terminal. And basically what's going to do is create some secrets, right? So you see that secrets are created. So we'll reference these secrets in a bit here. The next step we'll do is go back to my HCP management plane and then take the next set of commands, and I'm going to copy this, and it says to bring it into my Helm values file. So I'm just adding a new stanza into my Helm file. So again, we'll go back to my terminal. I'll open up my file. It's called values.dc3.yaml, and I'll go to the global section and nest it inside the global section and add that stanza. And this is going to reference the secrets I created earlier. And then the last step is actually just doing the upgrade itself. So I'm going to run this Helm upgrade command to basically apply these changes that I just added to my file. All right, so it's going to take a few minutes here. So back in my HCP management plane, it shows that it's pending. It'll take a few minutes, so we'll come back. And when we come back, I'll also add DC4 as well, because we don't want to go through the same exact steps for my fourth Consul cluster. In any case, it's going to go from pending to running when we come back, and we'll see all four. Okay, so we're back, and you see that there are 4 Consul clusters in total. We do have DC3 and DC4 now part of HCP, and you can see it, and we can start managing it. And we can start doing things like cluster peering and doing service failover. So let's go ahead and go to cluster peering. And I'm going to click on Create Cluster Connection. I'm going to select DC3 and DC4, the new ones that we just linked. And I'll just use the default partition. And once we do that, we'll say Create, and HCP is going to go and connect the 2 clusters for us. And again, we'll come back because it'll take a couple minutes. When it's done, you see the status is going to active. And so now that means they're connected, but just because they're connected does not mean that services can communicate with each other yet. So we got to do a few additional steps here. Before we do that, we're going to apply and deploy our application. So I'm going to deploy an application called Counting. It consists of 2 services, a dashboard service and a counting service. The dashboard service is the downstream. It's going to reach out and talk to the upstream counting service. Right? And if we want to look at the application itself, let's take a look at the IP of the dashboard service. And we'll copy that, and we'll bring up a browser, open up a new tab, and add that IP address with the appropriate port to it. And we'll see that the application indeed will just basically count, right? The dashboard is a web interface that just reaches out to a counting service and just increments it. And then now we want to apply another service called accounting service, same name, except it's going to be in a different cluster, right? This is going to serve as our failover service. So it's going to be deployed on DC4. So here's our topology. We have dashboard on DC3. It's talking to accounting service on DC3 as well. On DC4, we have another accounting service, as I mentioned, and again, it's going to serve as our failover service when we fail the accounting service on DC3, right? All right, so that's our current topology. The next thing we want to do is now make the two counting services as the same. Right now, they're seen as different services. So let's make them the same by using a sameness config entry. So I'm going to apply a sameness group config entry on both DC3 and DC4. Now let's take a look at this file. What this is basically saying is that in this sameness group, there are some members. Members could be partitions. They could be the name of peers. In this case, I have a partition default, and the name of the peers are DC3-default and DC4-default. These names are coming from the Consul cluster peering when we created the clustering in HCP earlier. So there's the names here, DC3 and DC4. So those are just references to the members of that sameness group. So now these groups are these two peers are part of the same sameness group. So here's what the diagram looks like now, right? So they have the sameness group across these two clusters. So we can take the sameness group now and apply it or reference it from other resources. So for example, we'll export some services. This exporting a service just basically says that we are allowing this counting service to be seen by other partitions or other peers, right? They can see it. So in this file or in this export service file, we're saying this counting service can be seen by anything in this sameness group that we created earlier. So this is much easier than listing out individual peers, names of different peers or names of different partitions, which you can just reference the sameness group instead, which is much easier. Okay, so very similar to that, we are going to apply the intentions. And the intentions are similar to export services where, we're going to say, hey, this counting service, you can see it because, export services allows you to see it. But to actually reach it, to actually communicate with it, you have to allow it using intentions. And again, this intentions file is just saying that this counting service is allowing anything with the name dashboard in the namespace default in the sameness group -A, it'll be allowed to communicate and reach this counting service, right? So again, this is much easier than listing out all the different names of all the different services of all different namespaces and have to list it out individually, right? We just reference the sameness group. Okay, so now the last step is to fail this service, the counting service on DC3. I failed it, so let's go to my application. You see that it now fails over and the counting service start over because it's reaching the counting service on the other cluster. So that's why the numbering started over. So we know it indeed failed over successfully, right? So that's a quick demo of sameness groups and also prior to that, linking services within HCP.
Well, that was amazing. And that was such a great demo showing how easy this is to implement. So for all the developers out there that want to learn more about the new releases we just covered, we actually have a link on your screen that you can visit and check it out. So thanks so much for being here and showing off that great demo.
Thanks for having me.